Thank you, Madam President. Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Today's debate is taking place in a very complex and pivotal time. Most probably not since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 has our planet been so close to a global conflict as today. We have an unambiguous answer as to how we ended up in such a dangerous situation. By striving to maintain their own dominance in the world, the US and its allies through NATO and the EU further dragged themselves into war with Russia in order to keep afloat the anti-Russian project in Ukraine. The root cause of this crisis, of course, is not in the efforts of the US at any cost to save the decisively bankrupt and battlefield defeated Zelensky regime, and is not in the natural desire of Russia either to eradicate the security threat stemming after the anti-constitutional coup in Kyiv in 2014. The reasons run much deeper, and we all understand that. The recent anniversary summit of NATO saw the collective West's mask finally fall, and the clear establishment of the years-long main aim of the alliance to inflict upon Russia, a nuclear state, a defeat on the battlefield. And we all know from declassified US State Department documents that the aim is to destroy Russia and to exclude it from any kind of security systems and cooperation. And that aim was established in Washington right after the fall of the Furthermore, this aim is taking on a new hue and more specific dimensions due to the efforts of the Russophobic small Europeans who are getting the plum jobs in NATO and the EU. For example, this is what is said of Russia by someone who was recently chosen by the leaders of the EU to replace Mr. Borrell from his beautiful garden, Kaja Kallas. And I quote, "There are many different nations which are part of Russia. If you were to have more smaller nations, it wouldn't be such a bad thing if the big power were to become much smaller." So how interesting the prospects are for cooperation with Russia, with politicians with such views. However, the appetite of NATO that has completely brought the EU to heel, and even before the end of the Cold War, positioned itself solely as a counterweight to the Warsaw Pact, this appetite does not stop just at Russia. Now, inter alia, at the summit that I mentioned in Washington, the NATO country leaders publicly have proclaimed their claims to play a leading role not only in the Euro-Atlantic region, but also in the Asia-Pacific region as well. It is stated that NATO is still guided by the aim to protect the territory of its members, but for that, there's a need to extend its dominance to the entire Eurasian continent and the surrounding maritime waters. The establishment of closed alliances, small geometry alliances such as AUKUS and other types of troikas and quartets are there. NATO's military infrastructure is hell-bent on pushing into the Pacific region in order to undermine the ASEAN-centric architecture. For many decades, that was established based on the principles of respect and taking into consideration mutual interests and consensus. The US and its allies seek to replace the inclusive mechanisms around ASEAN with closed, subordinate, confrontational structures that they cobbled together in order to restrain Russia, China, and other countries whose independent policies are perceived as a threat to their hegemony. The West, through its aggressive actions, has undermined a system of globalization that was to a large extent tailor-made for them. The response to any display of independent policies are illegitimate unilateral sanctions. Washington has done everything it can to blow up, including literally, if we're to recall the terrorist attack against Nord Stream, to blow up the foundations for mutually beneficial energy cooperation between Russia and Germany and Europe as a whole. Ultimately, Europe promptly loses its independent clout and slips into the role of an economic and political lightweight. dependent on the whims of America. Distinguished colleagues, the deadly threat to the whole of humanity comes from the fact that Western countries embroiled in an indirect war with Russia in Ukraine, headed up by the US, this is, have lost the understanding that a global conflict between key players is highly likely to lead to a global catastrophe. Still living in the Yalta Potsdam system of international relations set up after World War II, Western elites have moved away from the principles of realpolitik based on national interest and indivisible security. This presupposes that strengthening the security of one state should not undermine the security of another. A rejection of this understanding, demonstrated in particular by NATO's unfettered expansion, creates a real threat of out-of-control escalation that is well understood by our partners from the global south. The efforts of Washington and its satellites to practically completely destroy the system of global checks and balances and the fundamental agreements in the area of arms control show this. The US baselessly is trying to accuse Russia of this, but as we say, we've got it all figured out. So we see a decrease in professional diplomacy, a culture of dialogue, which is totally punctured now by threats and militaristic statements. We completely see something which dominates in the Security Council and the UN as a whole, namely megaphone diplomacy. As a result, there's been a deterioration and, in fact, an utter loss of channels of crisis communication. Thus, without an insurance policy which enabled humanity to survive the Cold War, now the world is unprotected, and any provocation or ill thought through step might lead to global conflict. In the context of NATO's proxy war with Russia in Ukraine, there's a danger of such a scenario increasing. Now, I'm not going to talk today about our views regarding the root causes of the Ukrainian crisis and the events that meant that we had in February 2022 to start our special military operation in Ukraine in full compliance with Article 51 of the UN Charter. We repeatedly have talked about this inter alia within the UN, and in particular yesterday. We have repeatedly proposed realistic options for settlement that would have enabled us to stop hostilities. Whether you like it or not, this is all down to Zelensky's clique. They already know in practice that each of our new peace initiatives that we proposed seemed less and less advantageous for Ukraine, given the dynamic on the battlefield, because they're hell-bent on self-destruction. You should recall the Minsk agreements and the Istanbul outcome document that was torpedoed by London and Washington. Now Kyiv is tearing his hair out because of missed opportunities, but that train has left the station. We've heard from our Western colleagues the usual trot today with calls for Russia to withdraw its troops in order to stop the war. But I'd like to remind you here that we sent in troops precisely to stop the bloodbath that Kyiv unfurled against its own citizens in the east and the southeast, and that the West in 2014, since then, stubbornly decided to ignore. So by having the troops in the east and southeast of the country, the Ukrainian regime grossly violated human rights and the UN Charter. It would seem that the new head of the UK government actually condemned his actions today. So this is something that occurred today. Therefore, Western solutions to resolve the conflict just don't work. This was clearly demonstrated in the pseudo-peace conference in Bergenstock, which no one was enthusiastic about apart from the Zelensky regime and his Western backers. We better understand the scheme proposed by the aforementioned Mr. Borrell. He said, I know how we can stop the war in Ukraine. It would just take a couple of weeks. We just need to stop supplying it with weapons. But that self-same head European diplomat specified that a victory by Russia is something that the West must stop at all costs. And that postulate is actually in the NATO Washington summit documents. So the Ukrainian crisis is just a part of the confrontation that the West deliberately, and long before the events of 2022, has plumped for as regards Russia. If we were to discuss anything with Western colleagues, then it would be that, and not issues of saving Zelensky's skin and that of his acolytes. We would discuss how to get out of this spiral of escalation, which is threatening to destroy all life on our planet, and unlike Washington and its allies, were prepared to engage in such a discussion and are still prepared to engage in it. Distinguished colleagues, I do hope that everybody here in this chamber understands that this unbridled worsening of the international situation must be stopped for the future of generations to come who are not in a position to tackle any of the geopolitical projects of Washington, Brussels, or London. It was going to be difficult to do this, but necessary. To kick us off, just as in the past, we need to have consensus on basic parameters for peaceful coexistence. Its basis must be the principle of non-interference in internal affairs, the respect for the sovereign equality of states, and security interests. There must be a new global security equalizing, so to speak, and guarantees that this will be upheld. We're convinced that its role in this equalizing can be played by our global organization because it's precisely the UN Charter, which is the cornerstone of the entire international legal system, as opposed to the so-called rules-based order, which is underpinned solely by the interests and whims of Washington and its satellites. It is based on the respect for the UN Charter that we, as painlessly as possible, can shift to genuine multilateralism that benefits all states in the world, including the US. The sooner Washington admits this, then the safer our world will become. Russia, at the end of 2021, proposed to the US and NATO draft treaties on mutual security guarantees. They included the principles of the inadmissibility of nuclear war, the non-harm to the security of the parties, non-deployment of military capability in border areas that might be perceived as a threat, and other important elements. Essentially, these are trust and confidence building and transparency measures that were an opportunity, but this opportunity was wasted as a result of the destruction of the arms control treaty system. Unfortunately, the West then haughtily rejected the diplomatic path because of disagreements. They wanted to extend their hegemony by maintaining the status quo. This was the West's biggest geopolitical blunder. The development of the events after 2021 confirmed this. In the initial version, the guarantee initiatives are no longer relevant, but the time has come at least to resume consideration of how or what security architecture there should be in the Euro-Atlantic and Eurasian region, what it would look like, and more broadly, how to move away from this dangerous block logic. This is particularly important for the global south that is suffering from the ceaseless geopolitical reckless adventures of the US and its allies, which are calling for resources not to go to militarization, but to go on development. You just need to stop and think how helpful it would be for the world if the tens of billions that have been allocated by the West to the war in Ukraine could actually have gone to development. In fact, the UN today is encountering a liquidity crisis because of US action. Now, we're not even talking about global humanitarian initiatives here. Undoubtedly, this kind of discussion is possible only with one condition: the West rejecting its confrontational bent with Russia and its illusion that it's going to secure a victory over us. Those who, despite the truth and common sense, are trying to demonize our country and threaten it, should recognize that a victory over a military power that still has enormous military and economic potential, like Russia, is just not possible in principle. I will tell you frankly, the West today is scared not of having a victory over Russia, but rather that truth will will prevail. And that will lead to the fact that countries in the world will stop fearing it. And that will undermine the US and its satellites' hegemony. And they can't imagine their own existence without that. And whatever nice, pleasant things the Western people say in this chamber. And since belief in justice and equity is linked with Russia, we have no compunction whatsoever about coming into this chamber as today the head of governments of a country said that is responsible for the most gross colonialist sins. And in fact, for most of the crises on the UN's agenda, that's what he said. We are in the UN with our heads held high, and we are proud to be here. Madam President, in conclusion, I'd like to underscore that, of course, truth will prevail, and we will help with that. The processes that are underway already are irreversible. Therefore, we would urge our Western colleagues not to try and hold these processes back, but to join with them and thus to establish new equal cooperation in the world based on the principles outlined in our statement. A positive alternative to this scenario just quite simply does not exist today. We want to believe that Western states still have enough common sense and the instinct for self-preservation that would help them as quickly as possible to recognize that. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of the